Well, good evening, everyone. Dr. Michael Fisher, fearologist, educator, researcher, and interested in what's happening in the world today and tomorrow and in the future. Well, look, if I had my choice, I would not be wanting to talk necessarily about the perfect storm that is shaping up to come into our lives, our future. And I'm speaking about not just the world, but particularly as I'm here in North America, in Canada myself. I'm very aware, that it would be so nice to just go have a barbecue. It's Friday night, it's a beautiful night, sunny here, nice and hot, have a glass of wine and chat, and never mind have to engage people in, why aren't we talking about fear tonight? Which is what I'd really like to talk about. No, I'd like to talk more about fear. Oh, I know. Yeah, I'm hearing you. I hear you. I hear you. And I hear the people at the barbecue, if I was to have such a thing. We really don't want to be talking about fear. We're sick and tired. Please don't bring up the pandemic. We don't want to talk about COVID-19 and all its variants anymore, anymore, anymore. That was just my little intro to uh, a certain level of anxiety, frustration, malaise, perhaps even. Let's just get on with life. Let's get back to normal. You've probably heard these kinds of statements during the last 2+ years of the pandemic. Well, tonight I want to focus on a book I'm writing on Sam Gillian Jr. and the importance of trying to understand where are we going, because his book is this is going to be a novel slash nonfiction fiction book, and I'll give you a picture of the title in a minute. I'll let you have a look at it, what I've designed roughly for the book cover. No, I'm not near finished writing the book. It's on its way, very early stages, but I want to read through the kind of outline I've come up with for that book, and I also want to uh, then lead that discussion into what's happening in the perfect storm, as I'm calling it. Some people are calling it, under the sociology, not just the epistemology or the epidemiology of what's coming, in the perspective of disease and crises in our societies coming into the fall 2023, moving coming in January. This transition 2022-23 into 24 is what the sociologist Nicholas Christakis, a sociologist at Yale, has been studying the pandemic phenomenon. He says we're now entering the intermediate period, and folks, we better understand and prepare for and really come to an awareness of what we're going into. Now, I'm approaching this all the pandemic, the phenomenon of meaning, mental health. There's going to be all these issues, terror management theory I'm going to bring up tonight. Stick with me. I think it'll be a very interesting monologue, but of course you can dialogue by your comments on the screen below, and let's keep this conversation going and make it live and real. That leads also to real actions of not only how you personally live your life, but how we collectively are going to go through this intermediate cycling of this stage of a massive pandemic that, according to Christakis, that we've gone through the tsunami of the COVID pandemic. The pandemic isn't over, but now we have to do the cleanup. And there's a whole lot of people that want to just, oh, it's over. Let's get back to normal. Let's not wear masks. Let's have big mass gatherings and not worry about COVID and so on. I'm not going to get any more boosters. Forget it. A lot of issues going on, right? So we'll be approaching some of those tonight with you. I'm gonna can't go into it in all fine details, but I do want to introduce this really interesting data that the sociologist Nicholas Christakis is bringing forth. Very highly reputable, sociologist out of um, Yale, as well as what happened. We have to understand the dynamics of fear that are going to play out. I call it the ecology of fear that's going to play out as we move into this intermediate next 22, 23. up to probably 24 before we'll be even a little bit more with our heads out of the COVID pandemic. But of course, you and I know, and others know, there are other kinds of viral endemics and potential pandemics of other kinds that will come and are going to come. And of course, this has been a very severe one. All right, where do we start? Let's just start by taking a few breaths. So, Dr. Fisher is asking us to talk more about fear than we are. Yes, it's true. And is that going to make us more fearful? Yes, it may. Is that going to be healthy? Yes, if we do it in a good way. We can also talk about fear in ways through discourses of fear that are not so healthy, that lead to paranoiac, conspiratorial, and or just a panic complex. Well, as you know, as a fearologist, as a fear analyst, as a fearologist in my own way, etc., I am not at all interested. I've spent 33 years on trying to figure out how to talk about fear and fearlessness in different ways that are actually effective. Well, most people that are spreading the bad news of what we should be afraid of, be afraid, and so on, that they also are not people, well intended perhaps, but they're not people who have studied fear and fearlessness for 33 years, like I have as a researcher and scholar. So I think tonight that's what I'm offering you is a unique perspective and unique attitude to bring to it. And walk with me for a while. Let's check it out and see if this is appealing to you to enter more talk about fear as we go into this intermediate period, as they say. So maybe we'll start with just some statistics, I guess, from the sociologist Christakis. I'll put his name in below. So the things that are really coming up for me is, I'm sitting out there having my iced tea out on the lawn, and I'm watching this video of him's recent talk. I'm going, okay, yeah, Michael, you need to do a video. This is serious stuff we're going into now. Let's call it the cleanup of the pandemic, but multiple cascading crises around the pandemic phenomenon, sociologically mostly, but psychologically, spiritually, economically, as you know. My focus, of course, my specialty is on the social emotional aspects of life in general and education in general, and obviously the pandemic cannot be ignored in those contexts. So, a few interesting, thought-provoking, perhaps fear-provoking in a good way, if we choose to together walk through the CDC data coming out of America, it's the Center for Disease Control, reputable for the most part. Nothing's perfect in that terms of bias, but reputable research national survey of self-reporting during the COVID-19. From the survey was done in 2021, so collected quite a bit of data, self-reporting in youth. Youth, the exact ages in this one are grade 9s to 12, national broad survey across the nation in America. Indicative, not always specific to your area specifically, or even here in Canada per se, but I think probably pretty darn close to trends that we need to pay attention to. So first off, mental health has been declining in terms of its resilience and stability, in terms of its strength in youth since 2010 to 2019. Research he's pointing out rising levels of self-harm, depression, anxiety, suicidality, and the use of psychoactive drugs. Those would be prescription. Of course, there's those using non-prescription for the very same purposes to cope with life. And the pandemic, since that time, of course, as he says, data is firm everywhere pretty much that this pandemic has exacerbated these mental health crises, problems as a collective. And we, again, that is part of our cleanup post-pandemic that he's speaking of. And he says the research on all pandemics in history, as he's studied them sociologically, is there's always these kinds of problems, and recorded back in thousands of years history, sometimes even. These are bad times, psychologically, sociologically, for mental health. There are plagues have been well known and documented to bring about malaises within a society, a certain lack of meaning, a lack of purpose, a certain hopelessness, etc. And that adds to many of the other problems. Of course, today it's a much complex world where youth are interacting on social media at an enormous, unprecedented degree, and what effect that has on their mental health. Those are other conversations, more detailed, we can have. Lots of people are talking about it, so let's keep all those in mind. But major three statistics I find use in this grade 9 to grade 12 survey, national, across America. Self-reporting, so they were asked about their own behavior, self-reporting, and this is the summary. 44% experienced persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness during the past 12 months, this pandemic period when the survey was done, 2021. My guess is that's getting worse as we are entering into 22 and moving to 2023. 20% had seriously considered suicide. 9 to 12 across the board. 9% actually attempted suicide in that period. Okay. Besides the fact, a lot of death going on, still, what are the ripple effects of this mass death, mass disablement due to a pandemic like the COVID? So he suggests that data shows 300 people a day are in the US are dying of COVID-related illnesses. It's not gone away. That could pick up as we move into the fall with, we know, increasing numbers of respiratory disease enter the population, viruses, and COVID generally will peaks in the fall and through early to the winter. More and more people inside, right? Condensing relationships and so on. And now people sort of really tired of wearing masks and not wanting to get boosters, etc. For vaccine and or just no vaccine at all, etc. A kind of bravado attitude, often, not always, and that, I'm not afraid of this virus. Okay, so as a fearologist, I'm listening to these discourses. So this is going to come up in the rest of the talk as we go into this evening. This attitude toward fear is as important, if not more, than what fear is itself and what are the fears. It's this attitude of relationality with the exacerbation of the pandemic. Okay, get a sense where we're going, where I'm going tonight. Thanks for sticking in. So 5 million survivors in the US, he's suggesting in the next year, predicting, we'll have 5 million survivors who have been damaged in their health significantly by the pandemic. The long-term cost of those damages through the respiratory system, to the heart, to immune systems, etc., will just have a massive amount of cost in terms of the healthcare system. So that is around the world. Again, he's just giving US figures. And then he says, which I'm going to quote here a short bit from his talk. One of the most important social and psychological impacts of the pandemic is the pandemic are times when there's a search for meaning. When there's a major disruption in a society, when people are dying and getting sick, or worried about dying and getting sick, people rethink the meaning of their lives. They rethink what's important to them in their own lives and what's important to society. This issue of meaning will come up in the discussion, and I'm really curious about the meaning of fear as it mediates meaning and the meaning that we have of fear in our life just in general. So, yes, it's about how do we create meaning in a world of, we're in the middle now, I say, of the cleanup of the tsunami of the pandemic. So we're trying to create meaning within there. But then we also know that there's more to come. And not only the other crises, global warming, et cetera, mass species extinction, and a loss of resilience in our general ecology on the planet. Life is under an increasing threat on a global basis of massive proportion. Never mind war, World War III, talk of, and so on. So is it no wonder that our youth, as they think about their future, as I gave those statistics, are having trouble mentally, psychologically, sociologically handling this. And so I'll be talking today again about how are people trying to handle the relationship to fear, terror, anxiety, panic, all those kinds of aspects of the ecology of fear, as I talk about. So those are a few of his statistics. And then I think we'll come back to now, my understanding of why fear plays such a major role in where we're going into in this intermediate phase. But before that, let's stop for a little bit of interesting play on the book I'm creating, brand new, just thought out, so I'm going to share screen. And go up to this picture, and there we go. So it's a book called Samuel N. Gillian Jr. That's his name. It's this photograph of him right there, probably in his 50, 55-ish. Lived to be 76, died in 2016, born in 1939. He's an American I've spoken about and written about. You can see some of my work on him if you just look up on the internet. The sort of catchword that I'm thinking for the cover, the man who wanted to make us all more afraid. By the way, this is not a publisher's cover. This is my own design. And I'm going to be looking at his life, his message, his courage. Very interesting life. He's not well known. I'm basically sort of surfacing all the material I can, doing interviews as well as research. And I'm going to be lifting his ideas as a major thinker about fear and fear theory. He has a very interesting approach. I've recently called him one of the three fearists in the world, at the core of the philosophy of fearism. Desh Suba is one, myself is the other, and Samuel N. Gillian Jr. is the newest addition to that. And that's in a book that I have at press right now. I'll look forward to sharing more on that. And it's basically called Philosophy of Fearism, a Primer. All right, so while I got that picture up, let me read my first go at, if I was to write this to a publisher, how would I write the description and my approach to this book? I said it's going to be kind of a nonfiction, fiction combination. I basically say it's a personal, social, philosophical crisis coming of age intellectually for a particular character in the book, who I'm thinking of will be a young 21-year-old woman. This will be evident. Here we go. This Sam N. Gillian Jr. 1939-2016 story begins in the mind of 21-year-old Deanna in her second year of English and African American Studies at Brown University. Deanna is the daughter of one of Gillian's older brothers, where she was raised in a middle-class Christian Methodist and fundamentalist African American home. Her visits to her Uncle Sammy, as she called him, home were generally enjoyable. She was struck by his sensitive heart and sharp mind, aware he was a different, even odd, kind of thinker. Yes, Christian, he was, but nothing like her father and the community of churchgoers she knew. That contrast grew into a blooming curiosity in her teen years, especially as began exploring diverse kinds of religions, spiritualities, ethics, and ways of healthy living. Deanna remembered the consistent counsel from her Uncle Sammy since she was a young child, where he would advise her to think for yourself, study hard what others think, and then compare and forge your own way of to think. Quote. But, quote, always stay aware to be open minded rather than closed minded. Her uncle asked her frequently, what's motivating in everything she felt, imagined, thought, chose, and did? That same question could also be applied to others she observed as well. Motivation in deep dive in this book is a focal topic of passion and the foundation of Deanna's story and Sam Gillian's story. The central narrative of the book, one paragraph. Deanna is given a full year essay assignment for an advanced English class to write about two authors, one white, one black, one female, one male, and to use their work to compare how they approach a similar topic of interest to them and to Deanna. This leads her on a quest of diverse experiences, research, and study, and sorting through the questions and answers behind a big idea that surfaces during this year. Quote, whose teaching on life, love, God, reality is most appealing and intelligent for the kind of world we live in today? So that's a 21-year-old second year university thinking her way through this assignment. And she comes to realize that her uncle is the man and he's black. And then she's going to figure out, I haven't figured out who the other character will be. I have a few ideas. There'll be a white woman in contrast. But all of it spinning around motivation and obviously fear. So the central problems in the book, besides the more obvious crises of global warming, species extinctions, and violence, the overarching problem Deanna is attracted to is the growing insidious polarity of viewpoints, which is characteristic of a culture wars in America that is ripping it apart at the seams. Most everyone who cares about democracy and basic goodness sees this polarity as worrisome and very dangerous. People are talking of another civil war. So here, this is updated politics of the actual state of what is going on. I want this book to really touch into those problems in America, but around the world. Last paragraph of the little intro outline. It turns out one of Deanna's choices of authors to study in the English assignment is her Uncle Sammy, black male, now deceased some 6 years. He wrote two elucidating nonfiction books, which is true, which did not gain popularity and are a great influence on society in their time. This leads her into a labyrinth of investigations into the topic of fear. What began as a simple understanding of fear for her becomes a more complex, even mysterious story, growing into her own conceptualization eventually of what she calls a global fear problem, capital F, capital P. Her uncle's fear theory is controversial and makes up a large proportion of her intellectual development and narrative in the book. By the end of the story, she finds a route to a new branch of existential philosophy that takes just like a home within her and begins her own fear theory and set of practices as part of the root solution to the polarity problem of a world in crises, and simultaneously and parallel with her own world of crisis. In her own life, she thus reveals in the book her quest to complete the university assignment and grow up into her own personhood in a very challenging world. Talk to share on that. It's always hard to write these little intros of a book before you've written the book, and I've only been working on this book for a few months now, so I'm just still chugging out how it shape it take. But I feel pretty good about that way of framing the book. So yeah, hopefully that keeps going. I think it will. Obviously, things will emerge as a writer. You come into all kinds of interesting twists and turns along the way. Now to the perfect storm that I spoke about earlier. Um, you can hear that I put polarity and polarization, political polarization within a culture of fear, these competing discourses, right, left, but even beyond right and left, religious, secular, and the many other discourses that are ripping, as I say, the seam of the fabric of a healthy sociality within North American culture, at least, but as I say, on a larger scale as well. So I'm very interested in polarization as a major part of the conflict, if you can call it, obviously, and the violence that can come from it. I won't go into all those examples. I'm sure you have a good sense of what I'm speaking about. But what we need to talk about is that polarization, real concern of many people today. Um, I remember just recently listening to Cory Booker. He's one of the senators in one of the districts in New York, ran for president in 2020, leader of the Dems, did not get in, but Cory Booker, African American young man, um, comes out of a, you know, he's lived the experience of the African American experience in America, and he's, says bluntly the most important thing he's worried about, he thinks is most important politically, is the increasing polarization in American society, the undermining of the unity and of the ideals of the Constitution of America and the goodwill of basic social polis, the city, the country, the communal atmosphere of collective care. This polarization, yeah, can lead to very deep distress. So that's part of this mixing cocktail of really the perfect storm. The other one is the pandemic and its influence on that. So Christakis, the sociologist I was just reading earlier with those statistics, now adds to that complex of this perfect storm coming. And it's already underway, but again, I'm predicting as we move out the end of 2022 into 2023, up to, again, one more good year solid of this real crisis of the intermediate stage of the pandemic phenomenon. We just cannot ignore the effect and impact it's had on all aspects of life, from the material to the spiritual. So that pandemic's coming. So one of the things I focus on, and some others have, is all the death reminders. And if it isn't death, it's getting sick and or may come close to death and or lose status, lose money, become helpless, become all the things that a disease can do, and then the effect of that on your family and circles around you and so on. So in the economy, definitely, whether it'll be able to hold up to this massive cleanup that has to go on in the recovery cycle, and then how people are going to pay for all that. Society is going to pay for it, and the governance. And then when you have the unquestioned, mark of who's going to be president in the United States, for example, is it going to be, quote, a fascist type of leader like Donald Trump, or is it going to be whoever? And all the competencies or non-incompetencies of a leader in this perfect storm. What happens in a pandemic when you get all that death reminder? Terror management theory, after the work of Ernest Becker, I've talked about it in other videos. I've written a lot about this, and it's available on the internet as well. Terror management theory, if you look it up, comes out of social psychology, and Ernest Becker was a very eclectic thinker, philosopher, and historian of many things. He basically showed, as does terror management theory, research. This is empirical stuff, lab stuff on the social psychology of behavior. With its problems, it's not perfect, but it has some pretty potent results it's showing, and I've followed this for probably 15 years, is that death reminders increase polarization. You can just give a death reminder to a group of people and a control group where you don't give a death reminder. You can do this subliminally in the most subtle ways of reminding them of their death or a potential death. Arousal that there's a huge part of our mind or subconscious or fear alert system that checks out. Oh, death, like how, why? Just like with the siren going by, oh, is this a, because it's a potential problem, right? It's a potential alarm signal being triggered. So the point is that when that is in a pandemic mediated through the massive media, we're getting death reminders constantly. And that research, both theoretically and some new research during the pandemic, are showing, yeah, people are getting more polarized because of just getting death reminders. Right? This is not just because of politics, ideologies. It's also exacerbated through death reminders. The other thing through death reminders is people lose the confidence in their meaning of life, and their self-esteem with that confidence and meaning of life drops. Then they become more aggressive towards others of difference to try to get their self-esteem back. So this is kind of in-group, out-group conflict, and that can be, of course, is exacerbated to the point of actual out-and-out war. We will kill others who think differently, in that sense, simplifying. And so just now put it all, both that reminder and terror management theory with the pandemic, with the polarization generally that's going on with culture wars, and that's a continuation of many issues, as I said earlier, that we then have mental health problems. So we've got this very destabilized self-esteem, loss of meaning of life, people searching for more meaning of life, and that's what Christakis says, the sociologist. We've got a large meaning, and he sees different data, more people going to church, other things that they're searching more for meaning, but at the same time, they've got a constant collapse of the meaning of life and a certain helplessness, hopelessness through all these pressures of the perfect storm. So mental illness is, as I started off with statistics of youth particularly, hits hard, and it's hitting us hard, and will hit us harder, and then that's will be the ripple effects of one hit, of another hit, of another hit. And you can see the whole mess of suicidology and murders and killing and crime that goes with that, and violence, right? And then the war is just like an symptom of all this mess, and the fearism becomes types of terrorism. Large topic I was just mapping out in that few seconds, I understand, but I think you get the idea. We have to talk about fear terror, if you will, but let's just use the word fear for now, or anxiety, if you will. I use fear as a fearologist. I decided that way back in 1989. If you followed my work, you know that. And so I was thinking a lot about where do we go with, in that book, Sam Gillian I'm writing, this young character in America. She's Black African American, and so on and so on. Um, she's the niece of Gillian, and Gillian's written these two books on fear. They're very exciting and interesting in my view. And they're real books, as I said, that's his real work. And I also have some other documents of his writing that are unpublished. So I'm synthesizing all that to create a story that would hopefully help shape any reader of this new book to come. Probably won't be out for another year or more. How they might negotiate this meaning crisis and all that goes with it in this perfect storm. That's really what this character Deanna is walking through in the book, The Perfect Storm. And I'll be pulling from Gillian's work, his life, his teaching, and his courage, and how he approached understanding of meaning and where we need to go, as Ernest Becker has done so as well in his marvelous work. The Denial of Death was his famous book, Pulitzer Prize winner in 1973. And Gillian is a Beckerian and Autoronkian. So he studied Autoronk, and Autoronk impacted Ernest Becker's work a lot. The whole history, intellectual history there of ideas. So that'll all be kind of pouring into this book as well. So I've got my work cut out for me to pull it together. And then today, I'm walking by the bookshelf, and I was just actually filing a book from one shelf to. I said, "Well, that's not in the right place. I should put that in another place on my bookshelf." And when I put the book back in, actually it was Becker's book. It was misplaced. So I was putting it in a new place, and then right beside it on the shelf, and I always like how my kind of field of mind, my gestalt mind, sees and goes, oh, and then I hesitated, and I go, oh, I touched that book beside it and pulled it. Well, what was it? Rolome, The Meaning of Anxiety. So really onto talking about how we're going to go through meaning through, right, this cleanup intermediate phase of the pandemic and all the complications of the perfect storm, mental health crisis, etc. And I started thinking fear, and this is the book I pulled it out. And I haven't even opened it yet. I'm pretty excited to do that tonight later on after this podcast. Maybe you have this book on your shelf. Maybe you'll have a look at it too, and we can have some good discussion on the YouTube here, comments, etc. And or email me, at any time. Like I love to connect and talk with people about perfect storm, etc. The ecology of fear that's coming. So this could easily be the meaning of fear as a subtitle. This book as a title, and really, it's an interesting shift, isn't it? But if you just take a moment, um, I'm talking about, you know, and many of the sociologists, Christakis, and many other commentators on the pandemic phenomenon as a large-scale problem, is that this meaning crisis, people looking for meaning of life, that's meaning of the self, meaning of new values. And Christakis is saying he's seeing people resigning from jobs, for example, during the pandemic at this point in the cycle of the pandemic. They're resigning from jobs that they really don't want to do because they're not that important. It's like, again, death is sort of in the crowd, right? It's the ghost behind the screen, constantly there and sometimes in front of our face, basically saying, are you doing what's really meaningful? Because your life is short. You may not be around long, especially if you get sick and diseased and the world turns into more just a crisis of crisis, and time is short. Yeah, this is the reevaluation of meaning going on. That's part of that dynamic. And so, but when I picked this book up, I says it's not about the meaning of life. That's the really interesting thing. As a fearologist, I just like, oh yeah, it's the meaning of fear, anxiety in this case. This is the existentialist, Rollo May, great existentialist, psychotherapist, theorist, um, predominant in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Um, I don't know if he's still alive, but yeah, he was an analyst at the William Manson White Institute of Psychiatry, Psychoanalysis, and Psychology. So he also has psychology background. Taught at Harvard, Princeton, Yale. So this is somebody very substantial, has had a big impact on existential humanistic psychology wave uh, of the field of psychology generally. So a big player, Rollo May, and I followed his work for decades and off and on, but I never sort of fully get onto it. But I'm thinking like tonight I have a reason to get onto it because I'm playing with this translation or this interrelationship between search for the meaning of life, in this kind of, as I said, in this crisis cycle we're in, and the meaning of anxiety itself, fear itself. So that is why tonight in the video, if I can just bring this to a close, I think we need to think about meaning making. People call it sense making. There's another conversation going on out on the internet about sense making. You'll hear that. Very sophisticated conversations by very bright people. But what I continually don't see in the meaning and sense making conversations continually is the deep discussion about fear, the meaning of fear, and that we have to talk about fear. Make my point. And it's an ecology of fear that we need to understand anew. This is really fear management education for the 21st century, which is something I've promoted since 1999. And that brings me to the last little bit is if I'm promoting, and I'm not the only one, but there's a few others, to have to talk more about fear. And now I'm saying, yeah, but it's talking about fear within the meaning of fear. And I think Sam Gillian, and again in that book, will be a lot. His work is directed to talking more about fear. That's why I like him so much. And him and I had this correspondence on emails, some 29 pages that I've just recently transcribed from the old hard copy emails I had 2005, late 2004. Will be included in this new book, that discourse, unpublished dialogue. And why is there so resistance to talk about fear? Now, I'm not talking about, again, the people that I introduced earlier in the video that like to talk about fear and throw fear out, get people's attention so that you can sell people to look at you and you get more hits, and that gets you more advertising dollars if you get more hits. Playing the whole market economy, right? The attention economy of fear, as some critics have talked about, and I am very critical of the culture of fear. And now Cory book, as I mentioned earlier, his center, he says the real problem is the culture of contempt. So he's not even talking about the culture of fear anymore. He's now translated the language to culture of contempt. Biggest problem. Oh, come on, you guys. This all comes from the culture of fear, which goes way back to research in the 1980s and even before I've traced that discourse. But it seems like we're wearing out of even wanting to talk about the culture of fear. Now it's the culture of contempt and hate. We found the new language, right, for where we want to, because speak, I guess maybe we're sick and tired of talking about fear. Well, I'm not. I should be, maybe, because I've been talking about it for 33 years, but I'm not. And I'm pretty convinced that it's still where we need to go to get to the root underneath hate and contempt and all these other languages, what Sam Gillian actually calls different fear words that are, scoot around fear, but they're all about fear, but they just don't talk about it. Right? And then you get people like terror management theorists. Yeah, they talk about it. Terror is right in the theory, right? Terror management theory. Well, mine is fear management theory and very related to, and I've done a video on that, just how we should terror management theory and fear management theory, in my view, work should be together and integrated much better, but it's not. But why is there resistance? Okay, as I end the video, I thought of two things. There's many reasons for the resistance to talk more about fear / terror. So I'm just going to talk about we don't want to. There's a whole huge voice in the culture. We don't want to. And I'm pretty convinced that we don't want to talk about fear, school, or that collective group. And I'm not saying they're bad or wrong. I'm saying, they're a really important voice and they're something we have to all pay attention to because it's part of my world, it's part of our world, it's part of our coming to analyze and come up with good, critical, creative answers to the problems that we're going into. But they don't want to talk more about fear because they're sick of fear. They're sick of talking about fear. They're sick of listening about fear. They're sick of seeing people's fear. And maybe they're sick of seeing their own fear under their unconscious. But on the surface, that's what they're sick of and seeing it in the society. And so I picked this up in the 1990, 89 into 90, particularly in the 90s, particularly, still around the wave of this resistance to being sick of so much fear in the world. And it was a youth movement, fundamentally. Primarily, it was the youth leading it. And so, how did it show up? It showed up in at least just two symptoms I'm going to give you. There's more than that. So, the first one was it showed up in a discourse called No Fear. That's capital N, capital F, exclamation mark, no fear. That was the slogan of the 89. I think it started exactly in 89 in California, West Coast, in this company that says, let's do this logo, no fear, and put it on all kinds of wear that young people would buy because they like this idea of no fear, kind of F you, resistance, rebellion, right? This is healthy spirit. Yeah, people don't want to be in fear all the time. They don't want to be in excess fear all the time. And so on. Now, Sam Gillian would have something to say about that, and I'll play with this in the book. I can't do it in this video, it's already long enough. He has a very interesting, different take that he would bring to that movement, that youth rebellion. So that was really appealing to the males, particularly, by the way. Still is in various forms, and it's morphed. That no fear movement, as I call it, a new social movement. And it's profound. I think it's totally connected to the non-maskers, the non-vacciners, and so on. People who don't want to be made to feel a fear, especially if it's coming from authority, governments, power down, right? Yes, it's a huge rebellion, and this goes all the way to the the MAGA camp of Trump and the whole right wing and the culture wars. And the female version of that appeared very soon. It was in the early 90s as well. I can't remember the exact date when it appeared, as Cosmopolitan magazine. Again, this is just a symptom of I'm giving you two symptoms, and there's many other sub datas for evidence for this movement. Very similar to the no fear movement, and it was called the fearless uh, movement. And it fearless as a word became tagged. It became the new signature of the bravado feminist female, the woman who's not afraid to take her clothes off or show her body on a porn video or whatever. But not just that. It was I'm here. I'll be whoever I want as a woman. And it was called the Fun Fearless Female, FFF. Started by Cosmopolitan magazine. Again, I think it was in 1991, just after the wave of the males finding their no fear. Not saying females didn't use that no fear too, but it's just another way to frame it. And that fearless discourse um, really is a designer fearless, put on all kinds of products, all kinds of advertising. It's a total cultural trope of reaction, arguably, in an analysis of a deeper way, to the same problem as we're sick of fear. We're sick of being afraid. We're sick of watching and hearing other people afraid, including our parents or whoever, friends or whatever. We're going to join this movement that's, no fear, fearless, the fun, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. That all is part of the extreme, what's called the new extreme movement. Extreme. These are powerful cultural discourse movements. They have a deep psychosocial, if not spiritual, resonance with what is going on in the culture of the time. And perfect storm, the resistance to wanting to talk about fear, and that's a bad combination. That's my concern tonight. Um, am I worried about it? Of course. In a healthy way, of course. Worry about it in a neurotic, anxious way? No, not helpful. So I pursue the path of fearlessness as one of my interventions. Sam Gillian in the book will have this tension because I'm the author writing that book. And I have this really interesting tension, as we did in 2004, 2005 in our correspondence together, him and I, for this brief time. Never met each other, but just through the internet. He's totally against fearlessness and fearless, and for different reasons than you might think. But he's, again, Ernest Beckerian and Otto-Ronkian informed, but his own experience as a Black person, young man living in the United States in the Bronx of New York, etc. I think I've given you a really good collection of things tonight to look at, folks. Thanks very much for listening. That pretty much wraps up my little performance for this Friday night, when I'd really rather be out barbecuing, hanging around in the beautiful weather, having a glass of